Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to do my best to try and explain to you the grants, etc. But I'm sure for those of you who've looked into them already, you'll appreciate that it's an incredibly complicated landscape of information, grants, conditions, different circumstances for different businesses. And with the best will in the world, I think the government have had the right intention to provide financial support. But it's very difficult to tailor that and make it bespoke for every individual business and their set of circumstances across the nation, as you'll appreciate, I'm sure. Consequently, there's some kind of generic stuff which is applicable across the board, and then there's quite a degree of variation and sort of finesse that really depends on your circumstances and where you are in terms of being opened or closed, and where we are in terms of being under national restrictions or not. So I'll do my best. Like Helen said, please come in with questions as we go along, if you like, because there is a lot to cover and sort of keep track of, and it might be better to cover questions at the point where it's relevant and pertinent to where we are in terms of what we're talking about. I would like it to be informal. It is a workshop. And again, depending on how you feel, if you want to disclose information about your own circumstances and business, I'm happy to try and field that and try and match it to what we know about what you might be eligible for or whatever. So feel free to do that. And I think, there aren't any daft questions. Anything you want to ask, feel free to do so, because it will be helpful for everybody, I think, just to hear the answer and for us to go through whatever the information is that you're trying to unpick and uncover. Right, so having said that, I'm going to now switch to a PowerPoint presentation, hopefully. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today then about the COVID grants, as they're kind of referred to, really. And these are the grants that were introduced basically from about last November. There was an initial grant scheme or series of schemes that started from about April 2020. They ended around September last year. So we're just going to park those because whilst they're related, they are a separate scheme. And maybe one thing for you guys to understand is that none of the information in the system related to that initial wave of grants was carried forward into this current scheme. So if you applied and were successful between April and September last year, don't assume that you're in scope and will just automatically receive payments for this next wave of grants that started around November, because that won't be the case. So there was a series of government announcements really before we went into, I think, what people might know as the second lockdown that started on the 4th of November, and grants were introduced at that point. And a lot of those are still currently payable. One of the things that may not necessarily be that obvious is whilst the announcements happened in November, some of the periods that the grants cover could well be earlier, because some of the cover was backdated for a variety of reasons, particularly to do with maybe different tier arrangements that were going on at that time. If you remember, there was sort of tier 1 to 3, I think, and then 4 was introduced at some point as well. So different areas could have been under different levels of restrictions depending on the geography and what was going on. The grant funding is from the government, and the local authorities really are an agency for administering and processing applications and payments. We also do have some decision making on discretionary grant schemes, but I'll talk to you a bit more about that shortly. But essentially what I wanted to get across is it's not council money that's being used for these grants, it's coming straight from government, and the local authorities are really tasked with being a managing agent on behalf of the government to kind of process and make payments locally to businesses in our areas. All of the money that we get for the grants has to go through to businesses. Local authorities aren't allowed to siphon any of that off or use it for any other purposes. It has to be used purely for making grant payments to businesses. Something just to make you aware of, if you're not already, is that the grants that are paid to businesses do not need to be repaid. They are genuinely a grant. They're not a loan. The only time that's not the case is if there's been a payment in error or if the application turns out to be fraudulent. I'm sure you'll appreciate that we would reserve the right to recover money on those circumstances. Another point just to be aware of is any grant income that's received by a business is taxable. Businesses will need to include that grant as income on their tax return. And then a final point is that for the grants, the state aid rules apply. So this is a system whereby under European legislation originally, governments were restricted with regards to how much financial support they could provide to businesses, because it was considered to potentially be an anti-competitive practice. But the state aid rules do apply. They've kind of varied these as we've gone along. I'm not sure if we have any businesses that are of a scale where this will be an issue. So, for example, under a combination of arrangements, you could receive up to £11 million in government support at the moment before it's an issue, and you have to start thinking about whether you can accept further contributions. So hopefully, not many of you will have already received up to £11 million in government support in the last financial year. Or actually, it's the last 3 years that applies for state aid. So, if we start then, for me, I think that the easiest way I found to deal with it is to just kind of try and hold in your mind that the grants relate to whether or not businesses have a business rates account. Oh. Hello? Okay, so grants relate to whether the businesses have a business rates account, and whether you've been mandated to close due to either local or national restrictions. So you just need to ask yourself those two questions about your business circumstances, really. If the answer to both of those questions is yes, then you're in scope to receive the local restriction support grants. Now, there's a combination of these that kind of evolved really as time passed, because obviously we started off at a particular point in November, and then things evolved, such as coming out of the second lockdown that ended on the 1st of December. Different areas emerged, if you remember, into different tiers. So Manchester, Greater Manchester, were trying to make an argument to be in tier 2 based on our virus rates at that time, but the government decided that we should be in tier 3. And there were different arrangements in place at that time about which businesses had to close according to which tier you were in. So there were tier 3 restrictions from the 23rd of October to the 4th of November. We then went into a period of national restrictions from the 5th of November to the 1st of December. We were then back into tier 3 restrictions from the 2nd of December to the 30th of December. Tier 4 restrictions, which came in because of the virus rate spiking from the 31st of December for some businesses. And then from the 4th of January, 5th of January, went back into the current lockdown. So there are all these different dates and points at which your business, depending on its nature, its sector, its operations, may or may not have been required to close. And you'll be eligible and able to apply for grant support accordingly. There is information on the council website that goes into far more depth and detail about these sorts of criteria, which I'll give you the links to. But basically, we could be here till about 5 o'clock tonight if I tried to cover all of the detail for every single option that's available under this combination of things. But the main thing to bear in mind is, do you have a business rates account, and were you mandated to close? Generally, businesses that were mandated to close were those that had public-facing operations rather than being able to just carry on business online or from home. But the full list and detail is available on this website link at the bottom of the page here. So a key thing to remember about this arrangement is that the person or the business responsible for paying the business rates for the premises is the agency that will receive the grant. So there are some businesses I know will be in what we call shared space, which is basically where you're a tenant in some space and your landlord has retained the liability for paying the business rates. Your rent may well include a rolled up element, which includes part of a contribution towards business rates, but unless you're the individual named on that business rates account, the grant won't come to you. It will go to the person named on the business rates account. Now, there are also varying amounts of grant levels available depending on the payment cycle and the rateable value of the premises. So this list of different dates and requirements was a little bit kind of built as we fly kind of approach. And so the government started out with an intention to run payment cycles in 14-day periods, because they thought circumstances could change quite quickly and they might move areas into different tier levels every 14 days as a review point. Some of that then changed and they started to move into 28-day payment cycles. So there's a different range of payment cycles available, and the levels of grant are pegged to the payment cycle, whether it was 14 days or 28 days, and what rateable value the business is liable for. The rateable values fall into 3 categories basically, which is under 15,000 per annum, £15,000 to £51,000 per annum, and above £51,000 per annum. And again, all of that detail is available on that webpage that I've given you the link to there. And so if you were trying to just kind of work out how much grant might I be eligible for, you'd have to look through this combination of dates, payment cycles, and what your rateable value is to try and figure out what the relevant numbers are to put into the maths to come out with a number at the end. Basically, these national restrictions now, we know because of the roadmap that was published, are in place until the 31st of March, at least with regard to these grant payments. And I'm going to talk to you into a bit about some important changes that are going to come in at the end of March because of the decision the government has made about ending these schemes at that point. But essentially, you could be in scope for grant payments that could start as early as the 23rd of October and run through to the 31st of March, depending on the circumstances for your business. And that's the local restrictions support grants. So the other grant stream or line to bear in mind is the additional restrictions grant, which is what's known as a discretionary grant scheme. So unlike the local restrictions grant, which were fairly prescribed by government in terms of eligibility for businesses and payment levels and payment schemes, which were all dictated under those schemes, the additional restrictions grant is a discretionary grant. So the local authority was given discretion by definition over how much to pay. So the government gave some guidance.
I've forgotten about it. I've just gone in.
The government gave some guidance around payment levels as an indication, but gave the authority, the local authorities, the discretion and the decision-making power to decide whether or not they would pay up to that level, or indeed more. They also gave us discretion over which businesses might be in scope to receive financial support from these grant schemes. Again, they indicated to us at an early stage that their preference was that we should look to prioritise and target businesses that were in hospitality, leisure and visitor accommodation sectors. But beyond that, we were free to widen the scope once we'd kind of targeted those businesses for support as a priority. And Stockport has actually done that. We've had a series of iterations where we've widened scope. The other thing about this particular grant is that businesses that are in a supply chain situation that haven't been mandated to close are also in scope to receive financial support through these grant schemes. Again, that was originally targeted to supply chain for hospitality and leisure sectors, but in January, we were able to widen the scope for supply chain businesses that serve other sectors outside of those requirements. So under the additional restrictions grant, we've got a number of schemes that we're operating in Stockport. We've got a main scheme for businesses that have commercial premises or storage away from their main place of residence. So this is really for businesses that aren't based at home. And they've got fixed ongoing costs for their business operation, which they can provide, a statement on and some evidence for to us. And the idea of these grants is that we will provide what is effectively a form of life support to try and help businesses kind of keep going and get through the worst of times. What these grants won't do by any means is fully offset and compensate you for loss of earnings. If your business was, going a storm before COVID and you were turning over £1 million a year, and now you're down to £150,000 a year, the grants aren't designed to just fully compensate you for that change. What they try and do is recognise that you've got some fixed ongoing costs to meet during periods of closure or restricted trading, and we'll make a contribution towards supporting that as best we can within the design principles and the spirit of the scheme. So again, what's slightly peculiar about this scheme is it's ostensibly designed originally to be for businesses that don't have business rates accounts because they fall outside of the other scheme arrangement. But then because of the supply chain factor, we've had to say that actually it does include some businesses that do have rateable values. So you'll see on these links again the detailed information. If you're a business that's a supply chain that has a rateable value, you'll receive grant support according to those three levels, again under 15,000 a year, 15,000 to 51,000 a year, or above 51,000 in terms of your annual rateable value. Or if you have no rateable value, then there's a fixed level of £1,000 a month for, or payment cycle 28 days technically for businesses that fall into that category. So that's the main ARG scheme. Whilst we're operating this scheme, we're aware, I'm presuming some of you may well be part of the group that are referred to, I think, as the excluded, or be aware of this group of people who kind of started to fall between the gaps because of the way the schemes had been designed. Principally for us, this would relate to home-based businesses. I think there's also an issue for people who are directors of businesses who take their remuneration in the form of dividends. And we kind of moved our policy line a bit to try and offer some support through what we called a micro business grant scheme for home-based businesses to recognise that they were also in need of some support. Again, I think we know from feedback that there are some issues, that this isn't necessarily going to fully cover all of the costs that these businesses have, but it's a recognition from us that there is a need, and we're doing our best to provide some support for that. And so the micro business grant scheme offers a one-off grant for home-based businesses. There's a separate link at the bottom of this page for that scheme because it is configured slightly differently, and there's a different web page that provides information specifically for the micro business scheme. So for this arrangement, the additional restrictions grant, the periods that are covered are the closed periods from the 4th of November to the 1st of December, the 30th of December because of the Tier 3 arrangement, or the 4th of January because of the national lockdown, up until the end of March at the moment. This additional restrictions grant scheme isn't going to end on the 31st of March. It's the one current scheme that will continue beyond that date. So just bear that in mind. So now, just in terms of some process information about these grants, it's an online application form that needs to be completed. That's the only way you can get in to apply for the grants. And there is some supporting information to be uploaded, particularly for the discretionary grant. So we're asking, for example, for a copy of a bank statement that's no more than 3 months old. The reason for that is it's just part of our due diligence and anti-fraud process, because from that we can check the name of the business or the applicant and the address that's been provided, and we can also see the sort code and the account number for the nominated bank account that they want the payment to go into. When you upload this information for the bank account, there's no requirement to show any of the transactional details, so you can delete that out or blur that out in terms of the individual line entries on the statement that you might have. What we're looking to see is it's XYZ Bank, and it's for this business, and that's the account number and the sort code that they've given in the application that we've received. Everybody will be notified of the outcome of their application for a grant by email, regardless of whether it's successful or not. So I know we've had some contact from businesses who've made an application and they've not heard because it's taking us a bit of time to get through processing the applications, and they're worried that does that mean they've not been successful and we're just not telling people if they're not successful. That's not the case. You'll definitely hear one way or the other regardless. If you are successful, payments are made by backs into the business account that was given in the application form. So once the application's been fully assessed and processed, an assessor will email you to say, pleased to let you know you've been successful. Here's the amount that you'll be getting, and the payment will be made by backs. When you get that email, it's typically around 3 to 5 days that it takes for the money to arrive in your account, depending on when you're notified. So for example, if you're notified on the Friday, it's working days, so you'll need to allow through to the following Wednesday to Friday to see that money arrive in your account. If that doesn't happen by that time for any reason, you do need to get in touch with us, because there may be a system issue either at the bank's end or at our end in terms of a reason why that money hasn't successfully transferred, and you need to let us know as soon as possible, please, beyond the sort of 5-day period, just so that we can get onto it as quickly as possible to start chasing up what's happened. In terms of the discretionary scheme, if you're unsuccessful, there is a right of appeal on the decision that's been made. The details of how to appeal are provided in the decision notification email that comes. And again, we know from the feedback from businesses that unfortunately appeals are taking some time to be heard, so please be patient. The reason for this is the appeals panel is some very senior director level officers in the council who hear the case because they haven't been involved in the initial decision making, so it keeps that separation of duties. But you'll appreciate that there's a number of cases to be worked through, and depending on the nature of the case and the appeal, it could be very straightforward. For example, in terms of the applicant isn't a Stockport based business or a Stockport resident, so isn't eligible and doesn't qualify, and that can be relatively straightforward and quick as a appeal case to be heard. Or there can be some quite technical and sort of convoluted issues to think about and work through, particularly if the appeal information provided by the applicant is quite extensive. So an appeal can then take, 20 minutes, 25 minutes to be worked through in terms of the conversations and the considerations and to arrive at a decision. By its nature, that means that, we don't get through a huge amount of appeals in any one session. So do please be patient on those. I know it's frustrating, but, we're trying to give everybody a fair hearing and do the right thing on those. Something to be aware of is, again, at the government's instruction, businesses that are in breach of COVID regulations will not be eligible for grants in that payment cycle until they come back into compliance. So, for example, if I'm running a business and I should be closed, but I've kind of got my shutters half open and I'm letting people in and, doing whatever my offer is for them, and that gets found, and I refuse to do anything about that, and I'm issued with a fixed penalty notice, then I would not be able to receive a grant for the current payment cycle that we're in. It's typically a 28-day cycle. If I then agree to do the right thing and shut the business and not, be in breach of those regulations any further, from the start of the next full payment cycle, I'll be compliant and I would be eligible then to receive grant support for that payment cycle. So hopefully none of you will be in this situation or position at all, but you just need to be aware that at the government's direction, we are having to withhold payments from businesses that are in breach of COVID regulations and undergoing enforcement action. So in terms of contact, again, we know from feedback from businesses, they're hugely frustrated that we're not providing phone numbers. The issue for that is, as Helen described, we've got a very small team trying to process the grant applications, and it's a really tricky balance to get right around how much time we could afford to spend on dealing with inquiries and people, just wanting to know about the progress of their application, because for every individual who spends time doing that, they're not then spending time processing the grants and getting decisions and money out of the door. So we just took a decision early on that was we wouldn't make phone numbers available. We do have these email addresses here that people can inquire on. Again, I know that for some businesses they're a bit frustrated that even using these email addresses, they're not necessarily getting very quick responses back. But I'm afraid that just reflects the amount of capacity and resource that we have to try and put into the system to support payments and processing the applications, and where we've dedicated that resource and that time. You will get a response. So again, I can just appeal for you to be patient. But, it kind of is what it is, I suppose, on that one. And then a final thing at the bottom here is just this is the main government website with information about grants. So there's the whole range of statutory information that they've published and their sort of guidance documents and things about the grant information available at that site. So just in terms of going forward then, we found out on Tuesday this week that the government is saying that all of the current grant schemes, apart from the discretionary additional restrictions grant, the ARG scheme, will close for applications on the 31st of March. Local authorities will then have a month until the 30th of April to make payments for any applications that they've received by that cut-off point. And the reason the government do that is they want to get their accounting information kind of finalised and resolved quite quickly. So they set the cut-off date for the applications and they then give us a month in which to make payments. If we haven't made payments by that date of the 30th of April, the government will not provide the funding to make the grant payments to the businesses. So they say to us, as a local authority, you've got a choice. You can either refuse to make the payment, or you can make the payment, but you need to find it from your own budget locally. So obviously our preference is that we can get all the applications processed and get the payments made by that deadline of the 30th of April. So people will have no doubt heard at the budget announcement and just before actually about the new restart grants that were announced. We have very little information about these grants at this stage. Again, on Tuesday, we received this information that you can see underneath here. As far as we know at this stage, the plan is that there'll be a one-off payment. It will be for the period from the 1st of April, but it's not necessarily going to be paid on that date because, again, it depends how quickly the government passports the available funding through to local authorities, plus, importantly, the guidance about how is this going to work in terms of who's eligible and in scope, how much should they be paid, and what information does the government require us to get and check from businesses as part of a due diligence and audit process. All of these grants are fully auditable, and there's an assurance process that happens after the grant schemes have closed. So we're checked to make sure that we haven't just handed out money without being careful and doing the right thing and making sure that the applicants met the scheme requirements. If the government discovers that we've made any payments that aren't eligible or in scope, they will claw that money back from the local authority. So at the moment, all we have about the restart grants in terms of early indications are that they could be configured as follows. There's an element for non-essential retail, and again, it's the usual rateable value categories that they've sort of provided payment levels for. So if your rateable value is under 15,000 as non-essential retail, the restart grant is a one-off payment of £2,267, and then the £4,000 and the £6,000 for the higher rateable values. They've talked about hospitality, leisure, accommodation, gyms and personal care services, and the payment levels for businesses in those sectors under under 15,000 is the £8,000, and then 12,000 and 18,000 for the higher rateable value categories there. So we're waiting for more detailed information on the restart grants. As soon as we get that, we'll publish it as soon as we can. Depending on your thoughts and feelings about this session today, I think Helen and Richard are willing to set up another session as a workshop similar to this around purely restart grants if people would find that useful. Once we get more information, we'll let you know that. So for example, what we're waiting to hear is, will the government require every business to make a new application for a restart grant? Or will they say to us, right, local authorities, you know the businesses that are already in the system for grant applications, will allow you to make these payments based on the information you already have so that businesses don't need to reapply. That won't necessarily be our decision to make as a local authority. So once we know what the government wants us to do and how they want us to go about it, we'll design our systems and scheme accordingly, and obviously we'll publish that and let you know as soon as we can. So just some brief information really about how best to help yourselves, and in doing so, how to help us in terms of processing the grants and the applications. What I would say to you is, there's a huge amount of information here, I know, and it's still quite complicated, but I would advise you to do your best to review the current grant schemes and make sure that you've applied for everything you may be entitled to. These schemes are closing as of the 31st of March. So if you've not got an application in the system before that date, you'll have missed it and it'll be too late to do so. My kind of advice to you would be, if you're in any doubt, make an application, because you're better off being in the system and being told no, or being able to then appeal or whatever, rather than missing the opportunity because we've gone beyond that 31st of March deadline. So I would say, have a look and just consider, have I applied for everything I'm eligible for? And if not, think about making an application. When you're making the applications, and particularly for the discretionary grant, please do try to provide everything that's asked for to support the application. So, we're asking for things like your assessment of what the negative impact on your trade has been as a result of the impact of COVID, for example. We need a copy of a bank statement that's not more than 3 months old. Sometimes we'll come back to you and ask for further supporting evidence and information. So if you can provide that and supply it to us as quickly as possible, and preferably during the first application phase that you're doing, that just makes it quicker and easier for us to assess and process applications. The online application form isn't that onerous. It's pretty quick. If you read the guidance before you go into the application that tells you what you need to have available and ready, you could probably complete that in 5 minutes. It's pretty quick. And if you give us everything we need at our end, we can probably look at that, process it, and make a decision within half an hour, for example, and get that turned around and out the door as quickly as possible. So if you can attend to that, it really is helpful for us. Again, just an appeal to please be patient. Our staff are under huge pressures to do this additional work, which is additional work, as well as continuing with their usual work. So for example, my team are normally providing business support around people who are seeking different office space or access to business finance or guidance about HR issues, etc., etc. And that work hasn't necessarily stopped or gone away. And so the staff team are trying to deal with processing grants. That's additional work for them compared to their usual day job that they're having to maintain and do as well. So they're under huge amounts of pressure, so they're not necessarily available if you email us to give you an answer in the next 5 minutes. It might take a day or a couple of days. So please do just bear that in mind. And then finally, a plea: if you need to contact us about your grant application, if you're in the side that's to do with your business rates account, in any circumstances, please quote the business name and then give your business rates account number in relation to your inquiry. That is just a really quick and easy way for us to find the right information about the business that's contacting us and what their application is about and where they're up to, etc., etc. For the discretionary grants, if you don't have a business rates account number, or even if you do, if you apply for a discretionary grant, on that online application, the final page you'll see is a unique reference number. That's quite a long, I think it's about 10 digits, unfortunately. But you need to keep a note of that number because that's the unique reference number that will take us straight to your information. So if you contacted us to say, I've applied for this grant 3 weeks ago and not heard anything, I am Joe Blogs Limited, and here's my 10-digit reference number that I got when I completed the application, we can trace that and get back to you quickly. Compared to, in its worst form, for example, we get someone who emails us with an email address which is bob@yahoo.co.uk, just saying, where are we up to? And we have no idea who that is or what their application is for or what their business name is or what their application reference number is. So the more information you can give us that helps us pin down who you are and what your application reference number was, that's just really helpful for us to be able to respond quickly. Okay, and I think that's everything from me. So I'm happy to take questions or go back over anything that's not clear.
I know that you don't know all the details for the restart grants yet, but are those only open to businesses that have been forced to close, or are they in fact open to businesses to apply for who haven't necessarily been forced to close but have been impacted by, so basically haven't traded?
Yeah, you're right, Helen. We don't know, I'm afraid, is the short answer on that. My kind of feeling, based on what we've seen so far and how they've designed schemes and rolled them out, I would expect that the restart grants would only be available to businesses that have been mandated to close. I think possibly by definition in the name, a restart grant. But I think there would also be an opportunity for us to look at using the additional restrictions grant, the discretionary element, to provide support to businesses that haven't had to close. I mean, obviously, from a local authority point of view, our interest is to kind of restart and try and recover our local economy as much as possible and as quickly as possible when we're in a position to do so. So any financial support that we're in a position to passport through to businesses, regardless of closure circumstances, etc., we'll definitely be trying to do as much as possible within the rules of the government schemes that were, kind of determine how we're allowed to use the money. But there is additional funding available from the government for the additional restrictions grant. So the restart grants are one thing, which are related to business rates, as you've seen from that early stage information, as far as we know so far. But the government has announced, I think it's £425 million nationally as top-up money for the additional restrictions grant funding. Again, we're waiting to hear information in detail about when will that be available and how much of that would come to Stockport. But when it does, every penny of it will make sure goes out the door to Stockport businesses. So far, in terms of that first scheme I talked about that ran from April to September, we spent every last penny and didn't return any money to government. We're determined that all of that money comes into our local economy and our local businesses, and we'll do the same thing this time with this grant money.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Richard. I've got a question here. Can you please clarify what you mean by in the supply chain for the ARG grant?
Yes, I can. Again, it's quite a wide and loose definition for us. Our approach has been to try and look favourably and provide support wherever we possibly can. So, for example, we have given grant money to support print business who said, we're supply chain for hospitality because we print beer mats that go into pubs. Because the pubs have been closed, they've not been using the beer mats, and therefore, our amount of sales has reduced, and we've had a negative impact as a result of the pandemic. So anybody who makes a kind of rational argument of that nature, we're at home to looking at it and trying to be as supportive and as favourable as we can. So your business is better than anybody, is our view. So if you can make a case to me about why you would consider yourself to be supply chain, and to be fair, it's reasonable, and any kind of fair-minded or reasonable person would say, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Or if it's borderline, if we're giving you the benefit of the doubt, then you'll be in scope and we'll be paying grants on that basis.
Thank you, Richard. If you're not a ratepayer, is the only grant available the discretionary grant?
Yes. So if you don't pay business rates, you don't have a business rates account for your business for whatever reason, then the discretionary grant is the only grant that you can access at this stage.
Okay, and someone here who's in the SBIC over at Broadstone Mill says, I don't have a rate account, I believe, so would I apply for a discretionary account? You've just answered that. I'm still unsure as tech business whether I would be eligible for any grants. Should I just apply and see?
Yeah, again, when I was thinking about this earlier, you can imagine the dilemma for me was we've got in Stockport just under 14,000 businesses. And the nightmare scenario is that I encourage all 14,000 to just put in as many applications as possible for everything going. And then we just can't cope, and we wouldn't be able to process those sensibly in any kind of reasonable time frame. So there's a bit of a balance to say, don't just chuck your hat in the ring if you think, actually, there's just no way and I'm not remotely eligible for this, but I'm just going to have a punt. That's not the right thing to do. If you're in doubt, I mean, the thing about the tech business at SBIC, for example, I think the fundamental questions would be, have you had a substantial and significant negative impact as a result of the pandemic? So if your business has not achieved 25% growth this year, but only achieved 18% growth this year, we wouldn't really be looking to give you grant support because you're still doing well. Don't forget that the idea, the principles of this grant is it's a life support and a lifeline for businesses that are struggling because they've been seriously and significantly negatively impacted in terms of reduced turnover and the consequences of that on their financial position. And when we say significant, we're looking for a reduction of at least 5% and above in terms of your turnover and trading. So if you're a business that hasn't had to close and you still have had a significant reduction in your turnover and trade, because a lot of businesses are supplying end users who have had to close, for example, so their market is just reduced massively and the demand for their goods and services is reduced massively. So if that impact is visible and has happened to you, then yeah, you're in scope, I think, and you should be making an application. Again, because we've got the money available from the government to provide support for that basis at our discretion. And in the discussions that we've had in the council, a thing to just point out to you that I haven't mentioned earlier is that all of these grant schemes that we design and that we put out have to go through our political governance. So they are reviewed and signed off by the cabinet members who are responsible for supporting economy and managing the council's finances and resources. And our line in the discussions with them has always been that we want to provide support to businesses to help them to survive. What has tempered that is we don't want to be profligate and just give money away without being careful and managing it prudently to make sure that we kind of guard a limited resource and make it stretch as far as possible to support as many businesses as possible who are genuinely in need. So anybody who's doing well, and there are some businesses who've kind of flourished and been able to increase and grow as a result of the pandemic, just because of the nature of their business, we wouldn't be looking to pay grant support to businesses that are in that position. Regardless of what sector you're in, what goods or services you provide, if you've been negatively impacted by the pandemic, you need to get in touch with us and let us know and get an application in. Because as I've said, I think you could make a good argument about why you should have the support, and we are looking at that favourably and we'd want to hear from you.
So Leslie's just saying here, so my landlord receives a grant even though his business is not affected because I'm in a rented office, is that correct?
Yeah, I think if that's an arrangement where the landlord holds the rates liability for the premises, and we know, for example, in Stockport we've got a number of mills, so there might be mills where the owner of the mill business still holds the rate liability but sublet space to a number of tenants who don't have separate rates accounts. Just going back to that example at SBIC, for example, I think we've tried and encouraged wherever possible for businesses to hold their own rates liability in those units that we've got in the innovation centre. But not all landlords clearly have adopted that approach, and to be fair, it's not under our jurisdiction to tell them they have to, so they make their own arrangements as they see fit. If you don't have a rates account, but you're in a commercial space that you're renting, then you are viewed as being what we class as shared space. So even though you don't have the rates liability for that space, you should be able to access some support from us through the discretionary scheme.
Thank you. And Gary's asking, I'm in entertainment and have been shut down because of hospitality and weddings, etc. Is the discretionary grant my only option? I have a unit in Holdsworth Mill.
Yeah, so again, I think the question is, do you have the rates liability for that unit? If not, then the discretionary grant is the way forward. And it would also be the way forward if you did have the rates liability, but you haven't been mandated to close, so you can't access those local restriction support grant arrangements. That set of arrangements is very strictly controlled by those two issues about whether you've got the rates liability and whether you've been instructed to close. So you can't have chosen to close your business. Some businesses have done, understandably, because it's just not viable for them to stay open and trade, and they're trying to manage down their costs as much as possible. So if you're not mandated to close and or you don't have the business rates liability, then the discretionary grant is the one that you need to be looking at.
Okay, Gary's saying he does have a rates account number.
Right, okay, Gary. So I think then the issue for you will be that you've not been mandated to close as a was your business supporting events and weddings, did you say? Sorry.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. As we know, technically I think weddings could kind of go ahead at various points during this past year. So suppliers to that industry weren't mandated to close, but obviously all of their trade dried up because a lot of weddings just haven't taken place. So I think, Gary, yeah, your situation would be that you need to go through the discretionary grants side. I'm going to send the presentation that I used today to Helen and Richard to share with everybody. At the end, on the last page, are my contact details. So if anybody wants to contact me individually for a private conversation, just to discuss their circumstances and get some advice and guidance, by all means do that.
That's lovely, thank you. Leslie's saying, I received a payment for discretionary account last year and you stated that you do not have to apply again as the dates are prolonging. Is this correct?
It could be, really, Leslie. It depends on when last year. So if you had a discretionary payment in that first wave that happened between March and September, then you do need to reapply. If you've applied for any of the grant schemes from November, then once you're in the system, if you're eligible for further payments, we're making those automatically. What we are saying to businesses, though, when we make those automated payments, is you get an email that says, right, we've made an automated payment to you. If you don't still meet this eligibility criteria, you need to notify us straight away and the money would need to be returned. The reason we've done it that way is if we had to email every business and just check they still met the eligibility criteria, that would really slow down processing the automated payment run, because we couldn't press the button until we'd heard back from everybody. So our decision was, and we discussed this with our risk and audit team, we'd rather make the automated payment, send a notification, say, if you've ceased trading, for example, or you no longer meet these eligibility criteria, you've had more than your £11 million of state support, then you need to return the money.
I wish.
So I see Leslie has just added yes. So is that, yeah, so Leslie, if you've received the payment for the November schemes onward, then you should receive the automatic payments without necessarily needing to reapply.
She's just added yes before November.
So if that was the first grant scheme, then you do need to apply now for the current set of schemes.
But just bear in mind those important dates. 31st of March, make sure you have a look and see everything that you could be entitled to, work out the dates, have all the information ready to hand, just to make it as easy and smooth as a process as you can. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It's been really good to see you all, and good luck with any applications that you do make, and good luck for the future when we do come out of lockdown. Everybody does get back to where we should be. Thank you very much.